I'm very excited to have Souksavanh Keovorabouth here with us today. I am not going to attempt to say all of their clans, and I'll let them do that. So Suki is Dene, second generation, Laotian, queer, trans, and two-spirit, originally from Chinle, Arizona. Grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, assistant professor with a joint appointment in Women and Gender Studies and Applied Indigenous Studies. They finished their PhD in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from Oregon State University with a minor in Queer Studies, a concentration in Indigenous Urban Studies, and a certificate in Geographic Information Science. And they are currently finishing their second PhD in Indigenous Studies from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. And thank you so much for being here, Suki. And yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Hello everyone. Yat A Sha'e Souksavanh Keovorabouth Inishia, Kia Ani Nishle, Nut Uzi Bashashin, Ashia Dashache, Nut Uzi Dashanella. As said, my name is Souksavanh Keovorabouth. I don't have any slides because I have some ideas and thoughts prepared. So I kind of feel like a host right now, which is kind of exciting. But as said by Felina, I am an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University up the hill. So I drove down and it was good. Of course, before we begin, I want to, of course, recognize the lands that we are on. The University of Arizona is on unceded land, and we must recognize that, right? This is O'odham and Pascua Yaqui land, and that we should tend to it and care for the people as well. Um, so of course, I want to address the elephant in the room. I have the earrings on. I won't spend too much time on it, but I do also want to recognize the violence or the state recognized violence that is going on within the three universities right now. And I just want us to have a moment to have a breath together and recognize and be in solidarity with folks across the globe who are also experiencing genocide. Um, I am kind of emotional because NAU just had their encampment and 26 students were taken, um, and a majority of them were my students fighting for the end of genocide. So I'm very proud of them, and I just wanted to name that and that be in this space with us because I think what this new generation is doing is something amazing, you know. Um, so I don't have any slides, which is fine. Yesterday we actually had our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives kind of symposium at NAU, which was really great. We decided to do talking circles, but the reason why, and I'm glad and thankful to be invited by Felina and Billy as well to present or talk with you all. And of course, I want this to kind of be a dialogue. I'm super informal, especially with my teaching as well. So I like to have people think critically, ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask a silly or stupid question. There's no such thing. I think this topic and understanding ourselves as peoples is very important for us. I do have a very quick story. When I first got this job, actually, there's some tension, to be honest with you all, between women and gender studies and applied indigenous studies. And so that would be like AIS here, American Indian Studies. And one of the first things that was said to me was, AIS does not want you. And I was like, what does that even mean? And this is from a non-native person. And I already hung out with all of the native faculty, and I was like, this feels weird. And so when we kind of furthered that conversation, part of the convo was about my research. And just to give some clarity, a lot of my research is around gender, sex, and sexuality, all in kind of siloed sections, which is, of course, colonial thinking. But it's important for us to silo them because it helps us understand how colonialism functions. So With that in mind, my dissertation was on the intersections of indigeneity, queerness and transness, and also urban identity. So this triangulation of all three put together to look at Native American experience within urban areas, specifically Phoenix. Kind of biased because I'm from there, but also, fun fact, Phoenix is actually the third largest Native populated city in the United States. The third, right after LA and New York, which is like phenomenal to think about because it's like Phoenix, which is the fifth largest city in the nation. And of course, Arizona is the third largest native populated state in the nation currently, right after California and Oklahoma. And these are critical numbers because we notice it, we know it, and we're trying to reclaim our lands, right? And so that's one of the main reasons why I picked Phoenix as well to do my research. Um, and I think a lot of our conversations within each one get divided in very interesting ways. And I'll give an example. So we hear conversations a lot about being urban versus res, right? Which is a real conversation and a real thing. But what does that do for us as people? Not much, but say that someone is more native than you, right? And that's the idea and that's the concept of it. Around gender, sex, and sexuality, right? We know that with gender, there is man and woman. With sex, we know that there's male, female. And then with sexuality, we know that there's gay and straight, right? But then within queer studies and trans studies, and also like if we really want to get critical within Indigenous studies, we must analyze those gender constructions or those constructions of identities that are imposed onto us. Um, with all of that said, um, the faculty of Applied Indigenous Studies, not naming names, but if you want names, I'm just kidding. Um, they said that my work is not nation building, that the work that I do does not give back to the community because it talks about urban identity instead of res identity. We talk about gender instead of law and policy. And my response to them was that actually, in order for us to build nations, we must first understand our own identities as Indigenous peoples and what that means for us. And with that, that also means we need to understand ourselves within the construction of gender, sex, and sexuality, right? And what do I mean by that? Is that when we think today, unfortunately, it's in English, or some people might think it's fortunate, um, which is a binary system. And what does that mean? A binary system is literally two options only, and I gave them already, right? Urban, res, indigenous, non-indigenous, gay, straight, etc. Right? And it doesn't allow us to think or imagine or create worlds outside of that that we've already had before because of colonization. And so it's imposed things onto our bodies in a particular way to say that we have to be confined into those areas. I promise I'll get to MMIR, I promise. um, but with that in mind, I argued that we as people must understand ourselves and actually think about our cultural practices and teaching. So I actually wrote an article called Reaching Back that is open access. So if folks want to read that, I'll summarize it very quick. I trace history and I note that within Dene creation stories, we have stories of Nadle, which of course translated to English is two spirit. And I'll go into what that means in a bit. Um, but how it's been erased throughout our history as Dene people. We don't really hear about it. The only thing that we say about Nadle is that, oh, it's past. I was on a Dene LGBTQ panel of grad students, and they were like, you can't be Nadle because Nadle doesn't exist anymore. And I was like, actually, you made it not exist anymore by saying that, you know? And so, how do we begin to reclaim things into our communities? And how do we, like, vouch for our people and reclaim our own teachings. And I think that it gets really complex. But before I move on, I want to, of course, talk about the term two-spirit because I think it gets thrown around and people are like, I think it means this, I think it means this. And so, oh my gosh, what is that? Something's spilling, I think. The room is leaking. And I felt some splashes. Oh shoot.
Where is it at?
I don't, it's leaking from the ceiling, I think, or one of these is this
Miguel, is this you?
homophobic? I'm just kidding. Is this homophobia? I'm just kidding. Oh my gosh, that's so fun. Right. What is it?
Miguel, you made it rain in
Oh,
here.
at this point, I'm just like, who knows? And isn't this a new building? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It's really nice. Just letting the architect know if he's here or they're here. Okay, so Two Spirit, for folks who might know or want to know more, is within the 60s. 1969 is when the gay movement, which is the term at the time, started with Marsha P. Jensen, and Sylvia Rivera, who basically advocated for gay rights. And of course, right at the time, it's gay rights. We use queer rights now. And over time, that gets co-opted by white, gay, cis men in particular. Within that movement, a lot of people of color, especially Indigenous people, get excluded. And then we know at the same time, AIM is coming into play, right? American Indian Movement. So all of these different things are coming into play. And then American Indian Movement, we all kind of know our critiques about it. Um, Pretty misogynistic, pretty homophobic, and we should name that. Um, and so at a certain point in time, they were like, we don't feel comfortable within the gay movement, nor do we feel comfortable in AIM. And so what happens is they have in 1990 the third annual. Is there more dripping? Oh, oh no! I got scared. I was like, oh my gosh, run! I'm just kidding. So, um, Um, I lost my train of thought. Okay, so what happened was they had the third annual Gay and Lesbian First Nations and Native American conference in Canada. And they analyzed an example from Anishinaabe communities on their term and creation stories about queerness. And so they were saying that we don't need those two groups. We don't need the gay movement and we don't need AIM because we always know and have known within our bodies, within our stories, within our communities, that queer, this word queer or gay or whatever we want to call it, has always existed within our communities. It's always existed. And we can trace it back through creation stories. Or if you lost creation stories, you can trace it back to when colonizers literally erased your stories. What do I mean by that? Colonizers love to document shit. So if you look back, you can literally see, and actually, it's actually a useful tool for Indigenous studies and also gender studies to see policy and their diaries of them writing about what they did. And one example from Deborah Miranda, who is a queer Indigenous scholar, talks about gender side, but the Spanish would literally come in, and they were in what is now known as California, would come in, and if anyone didn't look the part of a male or female, according to Spanish rule or colonization, they literally would dig pits and put dogs in it, and they would let them eat with like they would literally throw queer people in there and the dogs would eat them alive. And these are actually documented accounts of what they would do to queer people or what we would now know as queerness, right? And so of course there's this level of conformity for surviving. And I think that is a story that we all can understand in some sense, right? Of how we have adapted and I guess navigated the settler colonial space, which I think is important to note. And why is that important to note? Because if we trace that throughout history, we then begin to understand ourselves today, because I think it's important and should be recognized that we can ask critical questions of like, is that how it always is, or has that always been how it was? Um, in terms of like, boys do this, girls do this, right? And I'm sure you all have heard that before. Um, or you can't do that because you're a girl, or you can't do that because you're a boy, and you shouldn't be doing stuff like that. Or you can't go to the ceremony because of certain things. And one of my, and I think I'm pretty right on this, but after the eclipse, not to give their business away, but after the eclipse, me and my roommate and his sister, we all were in hanging out together, telling stories, and at the end, we were gonna burn cedar. And afterwards, or I was like, we should burn cedar, etc. And she's like, I can't be in this space. And I was like, why? And she was like, because I'm on my period. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? And she's like, my dad told us that women can't be in this room where the cedar's burning. And I was like, I was literally raised by my aunties and my mom, and I have never heard that before. And I will double check. So I texted them all, and they're like, sounds misogynistic to me. And so I told her, and she literally was so scared to do it. She was like, I don't feel comfortable going out there where the smoke is. And I was like, okay, you do you, boo. Like, it's really sad because I see their trauma that has been passed down to them. And I think it's important to note that story because we see that is how our community lives today, right? We don't want to disrespect our elders. We're told that we have to respect them, which of course you can, and also critique in a very nice way or question things in a very critical way that's not mean, right? I can say, um, actually, I don't think that's how it has always been. And we know the S word, right? And in Diné ceremonies, we have one. It's not that name, but people have adapted it to be that name. And we have informed my grandma multiple times, and she's like, it's just as how I was raised, and that's how I learned about things. So we have definitely seen a generational shift in things, and I'm very hopeful for like the next generation. But to go back, sorry, I always go on these different tangents of stories and interweaving things together. Um, but within Two Spirit, right, if we think about queer, so let's start there first. So I already defined what Two Spirit was, is like we know that queerness existed before settler colonial contact. Queerness is a colonial construction, right? It defines people based on their sexuality, their gender, sex, etc. Um, and then, of course, we know trans, which they kind of go hand in hand. They're colonial terminologies to define people's identities imposed on a social hierarchy. And so, um, to understand it a little better, it would just be queer, trans, an umbrella, and then underneath would be LGBTQ, if that's helpful. So if you ever hear both, you're like, oh, okay, I know where it goes. Um, and what Two Spirit says is that it's basically this over here, but for Indigenous people, recognizing that Indigenous people have always had diverse gender, sex, and sexuality within our communities, whatever form that comes in, and we must recognize that as Indigenous peoples. And so, of course, it's been co-opted by some folks because I think people think it's a decolonial term, but it's actually not. It's like an indigenizing term for Indigenous peoples to reclaim our identities and our place in our communities. Um, but I wanted to get that out of the way because I think there's a lot of confusion around it. I teach the Indigenous Feminisms class at NAU, and super excited teaching a gender and Indigenous representation in the fall. I also teach a masculinities class, and that one's fun too. But with all that said, I still see students not knowing or realizing what it is. Even doing these talks, sometimes I've been in spaces where like They're like, I have never heard about Two-Spirit before, or I didn't even know what it was. And so I just wanted to always define it, just in case so we're all on the same page. But why is that important, and how does it relate to MMIR, right? So a lot of people have been switching it to MMIR, to relatives, because of the vastness and diversity of gender, sex, and sexuality of Indigenous peoples, right? And the ways in which colonization, people who are colonized, deem themselves able to harm and be violent toward our communities, right? And so all Indigenous peoples, unfortunately, are targeted by this. Everyone in this space, not to scare anyone and not to say that we're a vulnerable population, because we're not. I don't like that terminology. We're very resilient. It's the system that has created tactics to make us vulnerable in a particular way. And I'm trying to think about, so yesterday we had ours, and there was a lot of great and critical questions that were asked within our panel about what does it mean within the movement and recognizing, right? Um, and I do want to honor Next Benedict, who recently, what was it, 2 months ago, maybe? 3 months ago, maybe a month ago. My time is all over the place right now. Was murdered. And they were a child, literally a child, 14, for being trans. They're trans, I believe, Choctaw, and in Oklahoma, and they passed away because of the bullying, and all of that. So I think it's important and should recognize that all of this is still going on. And I think that as Indigenous peoples in the US, and I always tell my students, and I try to tell people in these talks, every single policy, every single thing that is going on in the US affects you as an Indigenous person. How? This is our land, right? This is our home, and they're imposing military onto it. They're desecrating it in multiple ways. They're building these different infrastructures that destroy our land, our resources, etc. They dispossess us, and then now they're creating laws that affect all of us in this space. And if you don't think it does, it actually does. So if we look and break down law and policy, if we want to be critical about it, the anti-trans bills that are coming out, if you look at it closely, it doesn't say anything about transness. It says stuff about clothing. So if you're seen, if this passed, if you're seen with the opposite sex's clothes, you could be fined. Anybody. It's not just for trans people or people who do drag, anybody. And people, of course, it is a target to trans and drag queens, of course. But people don't realize that it affects everybody in this space, right? And so if you're ever caught in those sections or even buying something, or wearing it, you could get fined, which is fucked up. And they do this within different policies and programs. They intentionally hide things or find loopholes to make us vulnerable, right? Those terminologies and targets, to get taken. And why do they do that? Because Indigenous people aren't supposed to exist today. So they do anything in their power to erase us in however way they can. Um, I like to tell people that as an Indigenous, queer, trans, two-spirit person, not so fun fact, but also a kind of fun fact. I am the only Indigenous, queer, trans, and two-spirit studies scholar person in the state of Arizona. And so that's pretty exciting and a great honor to have, you know. Um, and so I feel like it's been a lot of my duty, which I also have been very cautious and mindful of my time, um, to spread this awareness because this is my community. You know, Arizona is my home, born and raised here, so I want to give back in any way that I can. And it's been an honor to be working back at home on Dineta, which is Flagstaff, if folks didn't know, is Dineta, or part of not Navajo Nation, but it's our traditional homelands as Dene people and other tribal nations around that area. So it's been quite an honor. But so I say that I'm an Indigenous, queer, trans, and two-spirit studies scholar, but I also, I think when it's broken down, a systems of power scholar and how it operates and how it functions. And so if we look at an institution or a system of power, right? We already know what settler colonialism, and I always tell my students, don't get caught up in names. Just always think about settler colonialism. So about capitalism, settler colonialism, imperialism, settler colonialism, right? Neoliberalism, settler colonialism. Just refer back to that. I was like, people try to use this to throw you off, and it's a tactic to make people of color, people who aren't able or can afford education because these tuitions are fucking high and bizarre. Um, there are tactics to make us feel like we don't know what we're talking about when we do. So overarching, and we know it's a structure, and we all are can be complicit within the structure if we want to. And that trickles down. So, what are parts of settler colonialism? It needs enslavement of people to work for it for free, right? We see that with prisons, and we know that we had slavery, enslavement before. The second part is genocide. So they need to erase anybody from this land in any way possible. And then third, we need to dominate the world, right? We know that's happening now with war efforts. If folks didn't know in this space, the military budget is the highest budget the US has. The highest military. Why? When we could have free healthcare, when we could have free education, we could have all these different things, but they want to do it to military to keep that top tier status of we are superior and everyone must obey us. Um, and so when we break that down, it goes into institutions. What are institutions? It's leaking again. It's leaking again. That's so funny. Oh my gosh, this is hilarious. So when it gets broken down again, can y'all hear it? Oh my God. It's
Barry,
so
can if you can hear me, it's leaking even more now. Wherever you are, there you are.
it's okay.
This is
Thank you.
our awesome
No,
IT
thank
specialist here.
you. It's so funny.
This is an urgent matter for other reasons.
Yeah.
My apologies for the interruption.
No,
Is it
it's
leaking
okay.
on you?
No, I could just hear it, and I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well,
No, it's okay. Thank you. I just want to let folks know in this space.
Thank you, Barry.
Um,
apologies. So,
and so when it gets broken down from those three things, right, it goes into like institutions. What are institutions? We can think about it as structures. So, like genocide, enslavement, and war kind of aren't like very tangible things, right? They're thoughts and ideas that should be implemented, but they need tools for it to function, right? They can't just have it. And so what do? They create institutions that support it. So think about it as like a house. Settler colonialism, those three things, and then they need institutions to uphold it. What are those institutions? Education, prison, healthcare, and we can go on, right? And we see how that structure works, and it's like the legs of the machine. So NAU or U of A, not me getting mixed up. I'm all over the place. I'm at all three all the time. It's so funny. So U of A functions off of that as well. So within education, they have and abide by ABOR, right? Which is the top tier people that make the final decisions on everything an institution can do, education in particular. And that's why we call this an institution too, because it is an institution. And then how does that get broken down? There's a president, there's a provost, there's the workers for them, the cabinet, whatever we want to call them, and then it trickles down more to the dean, faculty, students, who pay the machine, right? They're the ones that pay it, while everyone else benefits, mostly the president, and that's a known fact. The president gets the most money out of anybody in an institution, um, and then below that are like essential workers, whatever we want to call it, right? And they deem it as that. And so they function off of that because they create it internally of a hierarchy to train people to believe and think about things in a certain way. And education functions across kind of three pillars or three institutions of like higher ed, and then grade school, etc. I wanted to break that down because now, if we think about, and this is what one of my articles is about, if we think about it in that way as a machine or a system, we now know that sometimes we cannot rely on systems that replicate these systems. What do I mean by that? We talk a lot about tribal sovereignty. We talk a lot about having our own native governments, native nations, etc., right? Which I think is great and empowering and all of that. And also can be limiting if they replicate this system, which some do. And the article that I wrote is about the Navajo Nation in particular, my home, which I'm proud to critique. If we look at the Navajo Nation system, there's a president, there's a vice president, and then everything below. What does that replicate? The U.S. And so my main argument of that is like, if you replicate a system of violence, what are you gonna do? Be violent to your own people. How is the Navajo Nation violent to their own people? They create laws or acts or policy that say queerness can exist here. The Dene Act of 2005 says that they do not recognize same-sex marriage within the boundaries of the four sacred mountains. There's a lot of work to repeal it. And the president at the time, the Navajo Nation president at the time, said that 10 minutes. Okay, great. The Navajo Nation president at the time said that that's not our top priority. Not their top priority, right? We also, if you're Dene, have heard multiple times that women can't be president. What's that same replication of? The United States, right? And we know that women and queer people have led our nations before through our stories, through documentation, etc. We only know that Chief Manilito and Chief Barbancito signed the treaty because they're men, right? The US government isn't going to sign treaties with women and queer people at the time in the 1700s and the 1800s, right? That's when the treaty making era was. So if you think critically about 1868, which is when the Navajo Nation Treaty was signed, women didn't have rights. Women weren't people at the time. Only men were people. And they did that same thing onto our communities. And so I'm working on a project now that looks at law and policy of Native American law and policy that actually documents how gender, sex, and sexuality have been inscribed within our communities through law and tactics of that nature. And so our perceptions of ourselves is unfortunately based on the settler colonial notion of ourselves, which is kind of scary to think about, but also kind of empowering at the same time. Anyway, I will pause there because I have 10 minutes left, probably like 8 minutes left, but I wanted to open it up because I talked a lot, and then we also had a lot of distractions behind me. On any questions, comments, concerns, I could also just talk on as well. But I want to open it up for any questions so far.
Any questions for Suki?
Yeah, remember, there's no such thing as a silly question. I promise I won't make fun of you. Or I might.
Melody.
Oh, thank you.
I'm getting my exercise in. Hold on.
Good.
Glad to see you with your two PhDs.
Almost. Yeah, thank you.
And I'm just wondering, as a cisgender woman, what can I do to support you in your work?
Thank you. So the question was how, as a cisgender woman, support my work. I would say share it if you're able to, which would be great. Share this work in general. You all now know that I am the only Indigenous queer, trans, and two-spirit scholar in the state of Arizona, which is kind of scary, and a lot of fights that's happening on my end. You should see, I fight a lot of people at NAU, and it's funny because I'm like, you can't talk to me that way. This is my land. But so it's kind of funny. And so I tell people that, and they're like, get thrown off. And I was like, and also our third pillar, which they're like, it's not numbered, is a commitment to Indigenous peoples. And it was number one, by the way, just throwing out some tea. It was number one, and then they moved it to number 3, and they're like, we promise it's not in any order. Okay, but I would say, yeah, I really appreciate it, and I am very honored to be in this role to mentor students, the next generation. As I said, they're doing very critical and amazing work. So I think supporting whatever I do, and I want to uplift other people. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there was another question. Oh, great.
Where can I like go to find out more about your work?
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Yeah.
So I have an outdated website, which I need to update soon, and I'll probably have one of my research assistants do it. But you can find it at, it's literally my full name, Keovorabouth.com. Yeah, which is pretty exciting that I bought it though. They didn't give it to me. I bought a domain. And then my Instagram. So if you want to follow me on Instagram, that would be great. It is literally Souksavanh.t.Keovorabouth. And my whole name is on the agenda as well. So you can find me that way. And if you need to contact me via email, it's souksavanh.keovorabouth@nau.edu.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
very simple. Yeah, thank you. I got. Oh, right behind you. Oh, right behind you. Sorry, as you stepped down.
Just want to say that you're awesome.
Oh,
Thank you for nurturing some radical students, and thank you for bringing that up. I got here a little bit late, and I wasn't sure if anybody had mentioned the violence that's happening in these institutions, and that just happened here recently, but so thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
So do you find spaces, because I know for us, and when we think about ceremony, you know, we're using a very colonizer lens to kind of identify people's roles within ceremony and who should be taking care of what responsibilities and all of those things. Do you have spaces in your community where people are challenging that? Because that's work that we're trying to do in our ceremonial spaces, is giving people the opportunity to take care of the instruments that they're feeling with, you know, whatever essence they're feeling in that moment, whether it be femininity, masculinity, or whatever combination of those things. So do you find that there's people in your community that are challenging that, practicing that? And how do you navigate that when we have such rigid, old school people in the community saying you're not allowed to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think an important one too. So there is definitely a lot of work that is being done, not only by me, but a lot of community members that I really want to recognize and acknowledge. So if people know Trudy Jackson, trans Deneb woman, who does a lot of work in Phoenix, and the super exciting. This year we have the first ever, just letting you all know, Native president of Flagstaff Pride Board. And so that's really exciting, and there's a lot of things happening and movement happening there. But for like ceremonies and stuff like that, personally, and through accounts from people's stories that have told me within my research, there's a lot of people who feel removed and disconnected from community because of being queer and not being able to perform or practice ceremonies. And then there's a lot that who are reclaiming it, right? And so there's a lot of people within my dissertation work, which super exciting. I got a grant to turn it into a book. That they are. In indigenous spaces, they don't feel welcomed at all, even though they're indigenous, right? And we see this concept with like the idea of mixed blood or urban identity, and now we're seeing it with queer and trans identity, right? And these are all just tactics of colonialism to separate us and claim indigeneity. So if we think about where that stems from, we look at policy. So if people know about the one drop rule, the one drop rule said that if you're one drop black, you're black. And they also used it for Native people, by the way, if you didn't know that. If you're one drop Native, you're not Native. It's their logic, which doesn't make any fucking sense, right? But they used it to, as I said, to keep that idea of we need more enslaved folks and we need less people to have claims to the land. And that trickles down throughout history. And so we, unfortunately, have been products of that idea of that one drop rule too, as Indigenous peoples. And how do we do that? Blood quantum. How do we do that? You're urban or res, and then you're queer or not, etc. And I think there's a lot of reclaiming that's being done by Indigenous peoples in urban spaces. And I think that's a valid space to do it in a lot of ways. And I encourage it. And I also encourage people, if they're able to and want to, go home. I was on a Dene, as I said, a Dene LGBTQ panel, and we had a pre-meeting, and they're literally, what they said was, the two messages we want to get across is learn your language and go home. And I said, that's actually is amazing, right? That is amazing, and I do want to recognize that. And also, we must also recognize the trauma that people went through. It's not going to be an easy task for people to just do that, to pick up their life and go home and learn their language and just be home, and practice ceremonies and all of that. There's trauma that needs to be healed. And what do I mean by that? My grandpa was relocated in the 60s to Chicago in the Relocation Act. And then, so he never taught my mom any Navajo. And then he was fortunate to come back because he worked for IHS or got a job with IHS. And then my mom was taken by the LDS Church in the Indian Placement Program, which she was. And if folks don't know about that program, they literally believed that if they graduated and converted into Mormonism, they would turn white, literally white. And so, of course, she was not learning her language in that. And so I think right now, I'm actually finishing up an article that is telling that story because a lot of people think it's just easy to be like, go home or learn your language when there's all that trauma within that one story I told you about. How do we begin to move forward from there, right? And I think that's an important and critical thing to realize and assess for all of us as Indigenous peoples is that we are all products of that trauma, but we also are very resilient, and we need, how do we begin to heal with each other instead of trying to be like, well, I'm more native than you are, right? Which I think is pretty powerful in itself. And I think there's one last question. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to tell you that I support you for you, and your words were powerful. Like, I like how you were putting yourself out there for us and speaking your own language and your opinions. And I feel like everyone should identify themselves as they want.
Mhm.
And everyone's beautiful in their own way. Like, I support you for who you are, and I think that that's just amazing, like the way you are, the way all of us are, because each and every one of us are powerful the way we are inside and out.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I just want to say ahiahe and thank you so much. We're running out of time. I went over a lot, but I just want to say thank you, everyone. And I really appreciate being here. If you want to, of course, learn more about my work, I gave all that information out. And then I'll be around for a bit today.